Have you ever felt like screaming into the void? Like standing at the edge of a cliff and shouting your deepest truths to an indifferent universe that never bothers to answer back? This peculiar human impulse to rage against silence, to demand meaning from meaninglessness, this is where our story begins today. In a world that offers no cosmic reassurance, no divine plan, no inherent purpose, what's left? According to Albert Camus, what remains is perhaps the most powerful human capacity of all: rebellion. Welcome back, philosophical wanderers. Today, we're diving deep into Camus' revolutionary philosophy of rebellion, not just as an abstract concept, but as a radical approach to living in a world that stubbornly refuses to make sense. While our previous exploration of absurdism revealed the fundamental tension between our demand for meaning and the universe's silence, today we'll examine Camus' surprising and even exhilarating response to this tension. Because contrary to what you might expect, Camus didn't sink into nihilistic despair when confronted with life's absurdity. Instead, he discovered something remarkable: that in human rebellion against meaninglessness lies not just survival, but authentic joy, solidarity, and a kind of freedom most of us have never tasted. Born in 1913 in French Algeria, Albert Camus was no armchair philosopher. His life was marked by poverty, tuberculosis, resistance against Nazi occupation, and increasingly complex political struggles. He witnessed fascism, colonialism, and the horrors of two world wars. He didn't develop his philosophy in comfortable abstraction, but in direct confrontation with the most pressing moral and political questions of his time. Perhaps this explains why his philosophy feels so alive, so urgent, so practical. Unlike many academic philosophers, Camus wrote for ordinary people struggling to make sense of a chaotic world. His novels, essays, and plays explore the human condition not through abstract arguments but through vivid characters facing concrete dilemmas. The purpose of a writer, Camus once said, is to keep civilization from destroying itself. In the aftermath of World War II, with Europe in ruins and the Cold War looming, this wasn't a theoretical concern but a desperately practical one. How could humanity avoid falling into either nihilistic despair or fanatical certainty, both paths that had led to unprecedented destruction? Camus' answer wasn't a new political system or religious revival. It was something both simpler and more demanding: a commitment to rebellion within human limits, rebellion against absurdity that never betrays the solidarity that gives rebellion its meaning. In his major philosophical works, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Rebel, and his novels like The Stranger and The Plague, Camus developed this vision of rebellion as the authentic response to an absurd world. Not passive acceptance, not escapist fantasy, not destructive nihilism, but creative rebellion that affirms human dignity while acknowledging human limitations. So prepare yourself for a journey through revolt, passion, and freedom, the three pillars of Camus' response to an indifferent world. This isn't just academic philosophy, it's a radical manifesto for living fully in the face of cosmic silence. When exactly does rebellion begin? For Camus, it starts in that precise moment when absurdity is recognized, when we finally acknowledge the fundamental disconnect between our hunger for meaning and the universe's profound indifference. Imagine waking up one ordinary Tuesday and suddenly seeing your daily routine, the commute, the meetings, the small talk, the mindless scrolling, with fresh eyes. Why am I doing any of this, you wonder? What's the point? The familiar becomes strange, the normal becomes questionable. The previously accepted becomes suddenly absurd. This moment of clarity, what Camus called waking up, is simultaneously terrifying and liberating. It's terrifying because the comfortable illusions that have guided your life suddenly evaporate. But it's liberating because now, finally, authentic choice becomes possible. We can find a vivid illustration of this awakening in Camus' essay The Myth of Sisyphus, where he describes a moment when the stage sets collapse and we see our lives as if for the first time. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day the wire rises and everything begins, and that weariness tinged with amazement. Have you experienced such a moment, that sudden vertigo when familiar routines lose their self-evident quality and you find yourself asking, why am I living this way? This isn't merely boredom or discontent, it's an existential awakening to the absurdity of human existence. As Camus writes in The Rebel, what is a rebel? A man who says no, but this initial no, this rejection of absurdity, contains within it an implicit yes. By saying no to meaninglessness, you simultaneously affirm that something in human experience has value worth defending. Think about it this way. Would you bother rebelling against something if you didn't believe there was something worth fighting for? Every act of rebellion contains within it an affirmation of value. When a person stands before an unjust judge and declares, "This is wrong," they're simultaneously asserting that justice matters. When an artist creates beauty in a world of ugliness, they're affirming that beauty has value. When you refuse to let absurdity have the final word in your life, you're claiming that human dignity matters, even in an indifferent cosmos. This is the paradoxical genius of Camus' position. Unlike nihilism, which surrenders to meaninglessness, or religious faith, which escapes it through transcendence, Camus' rebellion acknowledges the absurd while refusing to be defined by it. To better understand this position, let's contrast it with other philosophical responses to meaninglessness. Kierkegaard, confronted with absurdity, made what he called a leap of faith, a passionate commitment to religious belief despite its rational uncertainty. Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God but called for exceptional individuals to create new values through sheer force of will. Sartre emphasized radical freedom and personal responsibility in a godless universe where existence precedes essence. Camus rejected all these approaches. The leap of faith, he argued, was intellectual suicide, an escape from the absurd rather than an honest confrontation with it. Nietzsche's will to power risked replacing God with the godlike individual, potentially justifying tyranny. And Sartre's emphasis on individual freedom, while insightful, didn't sufficiently recognize the foundations for human solidarity. Camus' alternative, lucid rebellion within human limits, treads a unique path. It doesn't deny absurdity, but neither does it surrender to it. It acknowledges the limits of human knowledge without abandoning reason. It affirms freedom while recognizing the constraints of our shared condition. Consider Camus' most famous fictional character, Meursault from The Stranger. Initially, Meursault drifts through life in a state of passive indifference, neither affirming nor denying the absurd. But by the novel's end, he achieves a kind of lucidity about his condition that becomes the foundation for authentic rebellion. In his final confrontation with the prison chaplain, he rejects religious consolation and embraces the honest indifference of the universe. Is Meursault's rebellion merely negative, a rejection without affirmation? Not quite. In recognizing his solidarity with the gentle indifference of the world, he finds a basis for authentic living. His final thoughts turn to his mother, suggesting a recognition of shared human experience that transcends absurdity. This points to something crucial in Camus' understanding of rebellion. It isn't just an individual matter. There's something profound that happens when we recognize that we're all facing the same absurd condition together. While Sartre emphasized radical freedom and personal responsibility, Camus saw something different, the seeds of human solidarity in our shared confrontation with the absurd. As he wrote in The Rebel, "I rebel, therefore we exist. In that simple formulation lies a revolutionary idea. My personal rebellion against meaninglessness connects me to everyone else engaged in the same struggle. My no to absurdity is simultaneously a yes to human community." This collective dimension of rebellion was deeply important to Camus, particularly in the wake of World War II. Having witnessed both the Nazi occupation of France and the rise of Stalinism, he was searching for an ethical foundation that could resist totalitarianism without falling into nihilism or dogmatism. He found this foundation in the act of rebellion itself, not as isolated individuals creating subjective values, as some existentialists suggested, but as humans united in their shared confrontation with them. If I recognize value in my own rebellion against meaning, I must also recognize it in you. This becomes the basis for human rights and dignity, not grounded in religious or metaphysical claims. It's worth noting how different this is from traditional revolutionary thinking. If absurdity is the disease, you might think nihilism would be the natural response. After all, if nothing inherently matters, why not embrace the void? Why not surrender to despair or hedonism? Why not, as Dostoevsky famously suggested through his character Ivan Karamazov, conclude that everything is permitted? This is precisely where Camus makes his most revolutionary move. He looks nihilism directly in the eye, and then rejects it as forcefully as he rejects blind faith. Both, in his view, are forms of philosophical suicide. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, Camus famously wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, and that is suicide. By this he meant not just physical self-destruction, but also intellectual surrender, the abandonment of reason in favor of either nihilistic despair or unquestioning faith. Think about it. When confronted with life's fundamental absurdity, we have several possible reactions. We might deny the absurd through religious faith, claiming that a higher power gives meaning to everything. We might embrace nihilism, declaring that since nothing inherently matters, all actions are equally meaningless. Or we might, as Camus suggests, maintain the tension, recognizing absurdity while refusing to surrender to it. Have you ever found yourself saying, "What's the point?" in moments of frustration or despair? That question, both terrifying and liberating, is the starting point of Camus philosophy. But unlike the nihilist who concludes there is no point, Camus makes a radical claim, that we can create meaning precisely through our defiance of meaninglessness. Against nihilism, he argues that even in an absurd world, certain values emerge from the very act of rebellion itself. When we say no to meaninglessness, we implicitly affirm human dignity, consciousness, and freedom as values worth preserving. Our rejection contains within it an affirmation. Consider the character of Dr. Ryu in Camus' novel The Plague. Facing a city ravaged by a deadly epidemic, a perfect metaphor for the absurdity and suffering of human existence, Ryu doesn't surrender to fatalism. Instead, he commits himself to healing the sick, not because of any cosmic mandate or ultimate victory, but simply because it's what his humanity demands. I have no idea what's awaiting me, or what will happen when this all ends, Ryu reflects. For the moment I know this. There are sick people and they need curing. In the face of overwhelming absurdity, Ryu affirms the value of human life and compassion, not because these values are written into the cosmos, but because he chooses them. When I first encountered this passage years ago, it struck me as profoundly counterintuitive. How can someone maintain such commitment in the face of inevitable defeat? Doesn't meaning require some kind of ultimate victory? But Camus invites us to consider a different kind of meaning, one that's found not in final outcomes but in the quality of our engagement with each moment. This is what separates Camus from pure existentialists like Sartre. While both acknowledge that values aren't given from above, Camus insists that genuine values aren't created ex nihilo by isolated individuals. Rather, they emerge from our shared human condition and our rebellion against absurdity. Consider how different this is from Nietzsche's approach. While Nietzsche also recognized the death of God and the challenge of creating values in his absence, he ultimately located this creative power in exceptional individuals, his Permensch, who imposed their will on reality. Camus, by contrast, finds the source of values in our common human experience and solidarity. The true rebel, in Camus' vision, doesn't reject all values in a nihilistic tantrum. Instead, they engage in the difficult work of creating values within limits, values that honor human dignity, without making false claims to absolute truth. For Camus, this distinction became painfully concrete during his lifetime. Having witnessed the horrors of World War II, the Holocaust, and the Stalinist purges, he saw firsthand how ideologies claiming absolute truth led to monstrous consequences. The Nazis claimed scientific certainty about racial hierarchy. The Stalinists claimed historical inevitability for their revolution. Both used these claims to justify mass murder. In response, Camus developed his concept of rebellion within limits, a stance that rejects both nihilistic despair and totalitarian certainty. The authentic rebel says no not just to absurdity, but also to any system that sacrifices living, breathing humans on the altar of abstract ideals. Real generosity toward the future, Camus insists, lies in giving all to the present. This focus on the present moment, on the actual lived experience of humans rather than utopian fantasies, distinguishes Camus' philosophy from evolutionary ideologies. He rejects the notion that present suffering can be justified by future paradise. There is only this life, these people, this moment of rebellion. But what does this mean for how we live? If we reject both nihilism and absolute systems, what remains? For Camus, What remains is perhaps the most precious human capacity, the ability to create islands of meaning through acts of rebellion and solidarity. Think about those moments in your life when you face something painful or absurd, perhaps the pointless suffering of a loved one, or the mindless bureaucracy of modern institutions, or even just the daily grind that seems to lead nowhere. How did you respond? Did you surrender to despair? Did you retreat into comforting illusions? Or did you, perhaps without even realizing it, engage in a small act of rebellion, insisting on human dignity and connection in the face of indifference? These small rebellions, Camus suggests, are not merely personal coping mechanisms. They connect us to everyone else engaged in the same struggle. When I recognize the absurdity of existence and choose to rebel against it, I simultaneously recognize that every other human faces the same condition. My rebellion is not just for myself, but for all. This brings us to one of Camus' most powerful insights, the connection between rebellion and love. Not romantic love, not abstract love of humanity, but what we might call solidarity, a recognition of shared struggle that transcends the isolation of individual existence. As he wrote in The Rebel, "I rebel, therefore we exist. My rebellion affirms not just my own value, but the value of all those engaged in the same struggle against absurdity." In saying no to meaninglessness, I say yes to human community. This principle was evident in Camus' own political engagements. During the Nazi occupation of France, he joined the resistance movement, editing the underground newspaper Combat. His opposition to fascism wasn't based on claims of absolute truth, but on the recognition that Nazism violated the dignity that emerges from our common human condition. Similarly, while initially sympathetic to communist aims of justice and equality, Camus broke with many of his contemporaries by condemning Soviet labor camps. Unlike Sartre and others who justified Stalinist atrocities as necessary steps toward utopia, Camus insisted that no future goal could justify present inhumanity. His commitment to rebellion within limits led him to reject any revolution that sacrificed concrete humans for abstract ideals. But before we explore this dimension further, I'd like to take a moment to invite you to join our philosophical community here. If you're finding value in these explorations of life's most profound questions, consider subscribing to the channel. Each week, we tackle another philosophical conundrum with the same blend of depth and accessibility. Hit that subscribe button. Your future self encountering an existential crossroads will thank you. Now, let's continue our exploration of Camus' revolutionary vision and see how individual rebellion becomes collective liberation. What happens when individual rebellions against absurdity connect and combine? Can personal revolt transform into collective revolution without betraying its origins? This question haunted Camus throughout his life, particularly as he witnessed how revolutions intended to liberate humanity often ended up creating new forms of oppression. The Soviet experiment, which began with noble aspirations of equality and justice, had devolved into Stalinist tyranny. The question became urgent: how can we rebel collectively without creating monsters? Camus addressed this question most directly in his philosophical essay The Rebel, L'Homme Revolt, published in 1951. This work, which explored the history of rebellion and revolution in Western thought, caused a famous rupture between Camus and Sartre. While Sartre and many leftist intellectuals were willing to justify Soviet atrocities as necessary for revolutionary progress, Camus insisted that no future goal could justify present inhumanity. Real revolutionaries, Camus wrote, must remember that the revolution is not an end in itself, but that its only justification is the immediate relief of the multitude that it must avoid, before all, condemning itself to those who already suffer too much. This principled stance against ends justify the means thinking shows the profound ethical dimension of Camus' philosophy. For him, rebellion isn't just about personal authenticity as it was for many existentialists. It's about affirming human dignity and solidarity in the face of absurdity. This is what separates rebellion from what Camus called revolution without limits. True rebellion recognizes human dignity and refuses to violate it, even in pursuit of supposedly higher goals. Revolution without limits, by contrast, becomes so focused on its destination that it loses sight of the humanity it claimed to serve. Consider the French Revolution, which began as a rebellion against monarchy and aristocratic privilege, but eventually descended into the terror, with revolutionaries guillotining not just aristocrats but also fellow revolutionaries deemed insufficiently pure. Or the Russian Revolution, which started as a movement for workers' liberation but created the Gulag system. Or the countless other revolutions that have betrayed their origins by adopting the very methods they once opposed. As Camus writes in The Rebel, the revolutionary is simultaneously a rebel, or he is not a revolutionary but a policeman and a bureaucrat who turns against rebellion. The moment a revolution begins sacrificing individuals for its vision, it betrays the very impulse that gave it birth. But doesn't this position risk political impotence? If we reject the logic of by any means necessary, how can we effectively challenge entrenched systems of power and injustice? This is where Camus' concept of rebellion within limits becomes crucial. The authentic rebel fights against oppression and injustice, but with methods that honor human dignity rather than violate it. Violence may sometimes be unavoidable, but it must always be seen as a tragic necessity rather than glorified as revolutionary virtue. "I believe in justice," Camus famously said, "but I will defend my mother before justice." By this he meant that abstract principles, even noble ones like justice, must never override our fundamental commitment to living, breathing humans. In our own time, we might ask, how many movements began with legitimate rebellion against injustice, only to eventually adopt the oppressive methods of those they opposed? How many revolutionaries have become what they initially fought against? From political movements to religious reformations to corporate revolutions, how often do we see the corrupting effect of unlimited revolutionary thinking? The 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt, though coming from a different intellectual tradition than Camus, reached similar conclusions about the dangers of revolution without limits. In her analysis of totalitarianism, she showed how revolutionary ideologies, whether fascist or communist, justified massive human suffering in the name of historical necessity or racial destiny. For Camus, authentic revolution must maintain its connection to its roots in human solidarity. It must never sacrifice present humans for future abstractions. It must recognize that no one possesses absolute truth, and therefore no one has the right to impose their vision through violence or coercion. This middle path, between passive acceptance of absurdity and unleashed revolutionary violence, is what makes Camus' philosophy so challenging and so necessary. He rejects both quietism and fanaticism in favor of a measured rebellion that affirms human dignity without claiming divine authority. Consider Camus' own political engagements. Though he initially supported the Algerian independence movement, having been born and raised in Algeria, he later criticized both sides for their escalating violence against civilians. This earned him enemies on all sides. French colonialists saw him as a traitor, while Algerian nationalists viewed him as insufficiently committed to their cause. But Camus refused to sacrifice his commitment to human life on the altar of any ideology. His position wasn't moral relativism or both-sidesism. He clearly opposed French colonialism and supported Algerian self-determination. But he insisted that no cause, however just, could justify terrorism against innocent civilians. This position doesn't make for comfortable politics. It offers no easy answers or final solutions, but it keeps us grounded in the messy reality of human existence rather than seducing us with the false clarity of ideological purity. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre criticized Camus for this stance, suggesting that his refusal to fully embrace revolutionary violence reflected bourgeois privilege. But Camus' concern wasn't preserving privilege. It was preventing rebellion from devouring itself by turning into unrestrained revolution. In our age of increasing polarization and ideological absolutism, Camus' nuanced approach to rebellion feels more necessary than ever. It reminds us that authentic rebellion affirms human dignity and solidarity without claiming to possess final truth. Simone Weil, another philosopher whose work influenced Camus, wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. This attention to concrete human reality, to the living, breathing people affected by our political actions, is what separates Camus' ethic of rebellion from the abstract revolutionism he criticized. But rebellion isn't just a political matter. It's also deeply personal, a way of living authentically in the face of absurdity. And this brings us to perhaps the most challenging aspect of Camus' philosophy: how to maintain rebellion as an ongoing stance rather than a temporary state. rebelling against absurdity isn't a one-time event. It's not something you do on a Tuesday afternoon and then check off your philosophical to-do. It's a continuous stance, a perpetual engagement with the fundamental tension of human existence. This is where Camus philosophy becomes most challenging and most exhilarating. How do we maintain rebellion as a continuous state without either burning out or falling back into unconscious routine? How do we live with the tension rather than trying to resolve it? Here, Camus offers a revolutionary approach centered around three key elements: lucidity, passion, and limits. Together, these create what we might call the art of rebellion, a way of living fully in an absurd world. First, lucidity. The authentic rebel maintains clear-eyed awareness of the absurd condition rather than seeking escape through illusion. This means acknowledging that the universe offers no inherent meaning, that death awaits us all, that perfect justice remains unattainable. It means rejecting the comfortable fictions that might ease our existential anxiety but would also diminish our freedom. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, Camus writes in his famous conclusion to the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is conscious of his fate, that's his tragedy, but also his triumph. He doesn't delude himself with false hope, yet he continues to push his boulder nonetheless. Consider for a moment what this lucidity looks like in everyday life. It means acknowledging that your career, however successful, will eventually end. It means recognizing that your relationships, however loving, can't fully bridge the gap between consciousness. It means accepting that your creative works, however brilliant, will ultimately be forgotten. And it means continuing to invest yourself fully in these pursuits anyway. This lucidity isn't easy to maintain. Our minds naturally seek patterns, meanings, reassurances. We want to believe that things happen for a reason, that good will be rewarded and evil punished, that history is moving towards some grand culmination. Releasing these comforting narratives requires constant vigilance. The Buddha recognized something similar when he spoke of seeing things as they are, though his response differed from Camus. While Buddhism seeks to transcend desire and attachment as the source of suffering, Camus suggests embracing the tension between our desires and the world's indifference. It's in this very tension, he argues, that our humanity finds its fullest expression. Yet Camus insists that lucidity brings its own reward, an intensified experience of life itself. When we stop projecting meaning onto the universe and instead fully inhabit our present experience, something remarkable happens. The world becomes more vivid, more immediate, more real. Have you ever had the experience of looking at something familiar, a leaf, a human face, even a household object, and suddenly seeing it as if for the first time? That momentary clarity, that heightened awareness, offers a glimpse of what Camus means by lucidity. It's a direct engagement with reality stripped of our habitual interpretations and expectations. This leads to the second element of living in rebellion, passion. By this, Camus doesn't mean romantic passion, though he certainly didn't discount love and desire. He means a full-bodied engagement with experience, an embrace of the passionate life in all its dimensions. If the world were clear, Camus writes, art would not exist. It's precisely the tension between our yearning for meaning and the world's silence that creates the space for human creativity, love, and joy. Rather than diminishing life, the recognition of absurdity can intensify it, freeing us to engage with experience without the burden of cosmic expectations. Camus himself embraced this passionate living. Known for his love of soccer, swimming, and theater, as well as his numerous love affairs, he wasn't a detached philosopher, but someone who immersed himself fully in sensory experience. His novels vibrate with vivid descriptions of Mediterranean sun, the smell of jasmine, the texture of sand, testifying to his commitment to the most living rather than abstract theorizing. Consider how differently you might live if you truly accepted that this life is all there is, not as a cause for despair, but as a call to presence. How might you approach a sunset, a conversation with a friend, a piece of music, if you weren't always looking beyond the present moment to some ultimate meaning or purpose? The rebel, in Camus' vision, doesn't retreat from life but dives more deeply into it. They develop what he called an ethic of quantity, not in the consumerist sense of accumulating possessions, but in the sense of multiplying experiences, relationships, and moments of consciousness. What counts is not the best living, but the most living, he writes. The authentic rebel seeks not comfort or security, but intensity and awareness, a life rich in experiences rather than explanations. This emphasis on passionate engagement distinguishes Camus from the Stoics, who also recognized life's hardships but advocated emotional detachment as the path to tranquility. For Camus, such detachment would be another form of escape from the absurd condition. The rebel doesn't seek tranquility but intensity, not freedom from passion, but freedom through passion. But, and this is crucial, this passionate engagement with life occurs within limits. This is the third element of living in rebellion, the recognition of boundaries. Unlike the nihilist who claims that everything is permitted, the rebel acknowledges that genuine freedom exists only within constraints. These limits aren't imposed from above but emerge from rebellion itself. When I recognize the value of human dignity in my own rebellion, I simultaneously recognize it in others. My freedom stops where another's dignity begins. My rebellion against absurdity connects me to all others engaged in the same struggle, creating bonds of solidarity that constrain my actions. This ethical dimension sets Camus apart from existentialists like Sartre, who emphasized radical freedom, and nihilists who rejected all moral constraints. Camus insists that authentic rebellion generates its own ethic, one based not on transcendent commands but on human solidarity. The implications are profound. If I truly value the consciousness that allows me to recognize and rebel against absurdity, I must value that same consciousness in others. I cannot logically rebel against meaninglessness while treating other humans as mere means to my ends. My rebellion implies a kind of universal human dignity. This is perhaps Camus' most radical insight, that authentic freedom isn't the absence of constraints but the acceptance of the right constraints, those that honor human dignity and facilitate human flourishing. In a culture obsessed with unlimited choice and individual autonomy, this emphasis on limits feels countercultural. But Camus understood that without boundaries, freedom devours itself. The tyrant who recognizes no limits to their power ultimately becomes enslaved to their own unchecked desires. The revolutionary who acknowledges no constraints on their methods eventually betrays the very values that inspired their rebellion. Consider our current moment, with its celebration of unrestricted self-expression and its suspicion of any external constraint. Camus offers a necessary corrective, suggesting that genuine freedom isn't doing whatever you want, but doing what expresses your humanity while recognizing the humanity of others. Living in perpetual rebellion thus means maintaining a delicate balance between lucidity and hope, between passion and restraint, between individual freedom and human solidarity. It means saying no to absurdity while simultaneously saying yes to the present moment and the humans who share it with you. Practically speaking, what might this look like in your life? Perhaps it means creating art that doesn't deny life's darkness but transforms it through beauty. Perhaps it means engaging in political action that fights injustice without claiming to possess final truth. Perhaps it means loving deeply while accepting the inevitable limitations of human connection. It's an enormously demanding way to live, perhaps the most demanding philosophical stance imaginable. It offers no comforting dogmas, no final resolutions, no shortcuts through the fundamental tensions of existence. It requires continuous vigilance against both despair and false hope. But it also offers something precious, the possibility of creating meaning and value in a world that provides none inherently. As Camus concludes in his essay on Sisyphus, the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This happiness isn't the shallow contentment that comes from ignoring life's darker realities. It's the deeper joy that emerges from facing the absurd condition with courage and creativity, from rebelling against meaninglessness while fully embracing the life we have. In your own moments of absurdity, when the daily routine seems pointless, when suffering strikes without reason, when the universe remains stubbornly silent to your questions, can you find this rebel's joy? Can you maintain lucidity without surrendering to despair? Can you embrace passion while respecting limits? These are the questions Camus leaves us with, not merely philosophical puzzles, but invitations to a certain kind of life. We began this journey with a simple question. In a world that offers no inherent meaning, how should we live? Camus' answer, as we've discovered, is as challenging as it is exhilarating, in perpetual rebellion against absurdity, creating meaning through our very defiance. This rebellion isn't grim or bitter. Paradoxically, it can be a source of profound joy, not the shallow happiness that comes from ignoring life's darker realities, but the deeper satisfaction that emerges from facing the absurd condition with courage and lucidity. In the midst of winter, Camus wrote, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. This invincible summer, this capacity for joy even in the face of absurdity, isn't despite our rebellious stance but because of it. When we stop expecting the universe to provide meaning and instead create it through our choices and commitments, we discover a freedom most never taste. There's something deeply liberating about Camus philosophy. Unlike religious frameworks that promise cosmic significance but demand conformity to divine laws, or nihilistic perspectives that offer freedom without meaning, Camus presents a third way, the freedom to create meaning within the honest recognition of absurdity. Consider how this applies to some of life's fundamental questions. How should we face death? The religious person might see death as a passage to another realm, the nihilist as final extinction, but the Camusian rebel sees it as the defining boundary that gives urgency and value to our choices. Death isn't denied or obsessed over, but acknowledged as the horizon that makes our limited time precious. How should we relate to others? For Camus, our shared confrontation with absurdity creates a foundation for solidarity that transcends both sentimental love of humanity and utilitarian calculation. I recognize in you the same consciousness, the same rebellion against meaninglessness that I experience myself. This becomes the basis for an ethics without metaphysical foundations. How should we engage with beauty and pleasure? Unlike ascetic traditions that suspect pleasure as a distraction from higher truths, or hedonistic approaches that make pleasure the only goal, Camus embraces sensual experience as one aspect of the most living. His writings vibrate with passionate descriptions of Mediterranean sunlight, the scent of jasmine, the pleasure of swimming in the sea, not as escapes from reality but as affirmations of life in the face of absurdity. There's a strange dignity in this vision of humanity, not the dignity that comes from divine origins or cosmic importance, but the dignity of consciousness confronting the void without surrender, without illusion, without despair. The dignity of what Camus called lucid courage. This dignity is beautifully captured in the conclusion to the myth of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain only to watch it roll back down for eternity. Sisyphus might seem the perfect symbol of futility, but Camus transforms this image. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain, one always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his essay The Absurd, offers a complementary perspective. He suggests that the absurdity of human existence isn't tragic but comic. The cosmic joke is on us, but we can join in the laughter. This cosmic sense of humor, this ability to see our pretensions from a distance without abandoning our commitments, is central to Camus' vision of the rebel. In our hyper-connected yet increasingly alienated world, Camus' emphasis on rebellion as the foundation for human solidarity feels urgently relevant. When I recognize that my struggle against meaninglessness is also yours, something powerful happens. Empathy replaces isolation, compassion overcomes indifference, and genuine community becomes possible. I rebel, therefore we exist. In that simple formulation lies a revolutionary vision of human connection, not based on shared ideologies or identities, but on the universal experience of confronting an indifferent universe and choosing to create meaning anyway. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum, though coming from a different tradition than Camus, articulates something similar in her concept of tragic solidarity, the recognition that our common vulnerability creates bonds stronger than any differences of culture, class, or belief. This solidarity doesn't erase differences or resolve all conflicts, but it provides a foundation for genuine dialogue and compassion. Perhaps most importantly, Camus' philosophy of rebellion offers an alternative to both the rigid dogmatism and empty relativism that plague our current moment. Against dogmatism, it insists that no human possesses absolute truth. Against relativism, it affirms values that emerge from our shared human condition. This middle path, maintaining the tension between meaninglessness and meaning creation, between individual freedom and human solidarity, between lucidity and hope, isn't easy to walk. It requires continuous vigilance, continuous rebellion against both despair and false consolation. But it also offers something precious, the possibility of living authentically in a world without inherent meaning, of creating islands of value in an indifferent universe, of finding joy not despite the absurd but through our creative response to it. So as we close this exploration of Camus' revolutionary philosophy, I leave you with these questions. Where in your life might you need to rebel against absurdity? What would it mean for you to live with greater lucidity, passion, and respect for limits? How might you transform your own rebellion into solidarity with others facing the same absurd condition? And perhaps most challenging of all, could you, like Sisyphus, find joy in the struggle itself, not by ignoring the absurdity of existence, but by facing it directly and choosing to live fully anyway? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections may help others in their own philosophical journeys, creating ripples of the very solidarity Camus saw as the ultimate fruit of rebellion. Until next time, remember that in a world without inherent meaning, your rebellion, your insistence on creating meaning anyway, is perhaps the most profound expression of human dignity possible. It's not just philosophy, it's an art, the art of rebellion.